Hi, I'm Lisa Rubel from Quilty Zest, and today I'm going to walk you through all the steps to make my postcard views quilts. This is what the pattern looks like. It includes full-size templates for all three of these designs. We've got Dune Sunset, River Gorge, and Moonlight Mountain. And I've used my Find Your Way fabrics from Benartex to create these quilts. Let's take a look at the quilts. First up is Dune Sunset. And then Moonlight Mountain. And last but not least, River Gorge. Keep watching this video as I walk you through every step of the way to put these three quilts together. If you're looking to purchase the Postcard Views pattern, you can find it on my website, Quilty Zest. While you're there, you can also find a list of shops that are carrying the Find Your Way fabrics so that you can make your Postcard Views quilts out of that fabric as well. In this video, I'll talk about tracing the templates onto fusible adhesive, cutting out the shapes, and then most importantly, how to get all the shapes laid out onto your muslin backing to create each of those three landscapes. When you make this project, I hope that you'll share a picture with me, either sending it to my email address, which is in the pattern, or posting it on Instagram and tagging me at Quilty Zest. I hope you have as much fun making these landscape quilts as I had both designing them and making them myself. So when you're creating the Postcard Views quilts, it starts out with lots and lots of tracing. We've got all these template pages, and they all need to be traced onto fusible web. So I go through and I just trace everything all off of all of these 8 pages at once, and then cut them out and fuse them onto the correct fabrics. So one of the questions I get asked frequently with the Postcard Views pattern is how much fusible adhesive you need for all of the raw edge applique for these three quilts. I just finished tracing out the pieces because I'm going to make another set of these for sharing at quilt shops. So let's take a look. So as you can see, I've got shapes traced onto here. This is Heat and Bond light sewable from Thermoweb, and it's 17 inches wide. And I used several pieces of it, and I've got my shapes pretty well nested. You know, I don't have a lot of space in between them, but enough that I can cut them out and fuse them onto the right fabric. And I added it up, and I used about 4 yards of fusible adhesive. So hopefully that helps you do your calculations when you're headed to the store to buy some of that. When you are tracing the templates onto your fusible adhesive, and I like to use the Heat and Bond Light Sewable, make sure that after you've traced each shape, you label it both with the name of the piece that it is, like tree, sun, mountain, etc., but also with which fabric you're going to fuse it to, because it's really easy to get confused, especially with things like the trees where there's multiple different ones and not be sure which goes with which fabric. So make sure you trace over all of the labels from the templates onto your traced shapes. So when I go to fuse all of my traced templates on the fusible adhesive onto fabric, I sort the templates by which fabric they're from, and then I pull up that fabric and do all of the fusing on that particular piece at one time. And I try to do it in such a way that I'm using the fabric as efficiently as possible, so that I don't have a lot of waste from all of my shapes. So once, let's see if I turn that one around. Nope, it's better this way. So once I've got them all in place, sometimes you can even cut a little bit more off. Then I will go and fuse. One little tip for fusing on the light waypoints fabric. I like to put a piece of lightweight interfacing down first before I put my shapes on top, because these shapes, the moon and the snow on the mountain, will be fused on top of darker fabric, and then this sort of prevents those darker fabrics from showing through. Next comes the cutting. I use a large fabric scissors for most of this, although for some of the smaller pieces I'll pull out a smaller scissors as well. For straight edge pieces like this, or say the top of the sky, sometimes it can be easier to use a ruler and a rotary cutter and just cut like that instead. So I will go through and cut all of these sun rays with my rotary cutter, and then go back and hit the top and the bottom pieces as well. Now, with all the tracing and cutting done, we're getting to the best part of this quilt, and that's building each of the landscapes. So for each of them, I start out with a 16.5 by 20.5 inch piece of muslin that we'll build on top of. And I start at the top with the sky and work my way down. There we go. And so all of the pieces that go along edges have a 1/4 inch seam allowance built into them, so that the appliques will be in the seam allowance and not just going up to the edge of where we'll add the borders. So after the sky, and this is Dune sunset, by the way, after the sky we come for the water. And you'll notice that some of the pieces also have 2 lines on them on the templates for the, because there's a little bit of overlap built into pieces, so that you don't have to worry about the muslin showing through if you don't have them lined up perfectly or if you don't cut perfectly. So like I said, these larger pieces I will fuse on one at a time. But then when we get to the smaller pieces, I'll usually line up a couple at the same time. And this is meant to be Lake Michigan, which I live about less than an hour from, and then the sand dunes of Lake Michigan. And I grew up in Wisconsin on the other side of Lake Michigan, and our beaches and that type of area are very different over there than in Michigan. It's much rockier coast, and the water doesn't get quite as blue. Sometimes on the Michigan side, we get water that's so blue that you think it is, it's somewhere down in, you know, the Bahamas or that area, because it's such a pretty aqua color. There we go. First 3 layers of the dunes. And then we're going to add 2 more. The yellow and the gold. I have a lot of fond memories of climbing up and running down the dunes, both as a kid with my church youth group, and then also with my kids and my husband as we've gotten older. And you'll see I've got, if I pull this up a bit, I've got a little bit of muslin left at the bottom, and that's okay. You know, it just depends on how much you overlap your pieces. But it doesn't matter if you have a tiny bit left. There we go. I have all the pieces in place. Now I'm going to fuse them in. So after I build the background with all these larger pieces, then it's time to go back and add in the details. So I'm going to start with the reflection of the lake and then the sun, because those 2 pieces need to line up right along our sky and water edge there. So I'm going to set this one in place, and I want it to cover that top dark edge of the lake so that we don't have any of that showing through. And then what goes along with it is the outer sun piece, which is the orange. And they're gonna meet right in the middle, and I kind of center the outer sun on the reflection and kind of center the reflection in the portion of the lake that I have, and press those guys in place. And I typically will hold the iron on a fusible piece for about 7 seconds. I'm maybe not doing the whole 7 seconds while we're doing this video because it will take it longer, but I'll go back and press things when we're done. Give them a little extra. There, the yellow goes on top with a little gap so that the orange shows on all sides of it. And then I'm going to do the ripples. I get them all positioned in place, and they go down in size from longest to getting narrower and narrower. But beyond that, in terms of worrying about what is up and what is down, it really doesn't matter. And even if you wanted to add in a couple additional ripples, you could do that. Just get them spaced out along the reflection of the water. There we go. Okay. I'm going to fuse those in place. And then last but not least are the rays of the sun. And this is probably the putziest part because there's both the background yellow ray and then the little orange ray that goes on top. So I do all the yellow ones first, and there's 9 total. So I put 1 going up from the middle, and then I can kind of position 4 on each side of it. And I try to have the distance away from the sun for each of them be fairly equal, as well as having an equal amount of distance between them, but it's really just kind of an eyeball thing. And what I'm going to do is, now that I have half of these in place, I'm going to fuse these because I can get them all under my iron at the same time, so I don't have to worry about anything moving. Get those stuck, and then go back and do the 4 on the other side. And then I'll do the same thing with the orange pieces. But I do recommend putting down, like I did, at least half of the rays before you go to fuse, because as you space them out, you may realize you need to do some adjustments. So it's just better to get them all in place where you want them before you fuse. Then after you have everything fused down, before you move on to basting and quilting, just check it all out and make sure that all of your pieces, that you have pressed them enough that they are firmly adhered in place. And if you need to, do a little bit of additional fusing to make sure everything is in place. And now Dune Sunset is completely fused in place. It's time to add the borders and then baste it and do some machine quilting. So now we're moving on to Moonlight Mountain. And I think this is, for me, is the trickiest of the 3 to lay out, only because it has so many of the pine trees and they're all very similar. Whereas for the other 2 pieces, the the shapes are also different. You don't have to worry about which is which. But we're going to start out with that dark background for the sky, that dark teal, and then add in the two mountains. And again, the templates are created with a little bit of overlap, so we're going to work from the top and the back forward. And so there's overlap so that you don't have to worry about, say, having some muslin show through. So that's factored in already. And the two mountains actually come really close to meeting in the center, and then the river goes over the top of them. And so you don't have to worry if they don't meet exactly, because they will be covered by the river. But there you can see I've got a little bit that shows to get it over so that the raw edges align with the muslin. But I've got my taller peak on the right and my shorter one on the left. And then we're going to add the river in the middle. And every time I go to lay the river out, I always want to make it come out of this little notch between the two mountains, and then it's really long. So it actually is supposed to come up a little bit higher so that it looks like it's coming off of this gray mountain back here, not just where those two mountains meet, but it covers up the mountains really nicely. So I'm going to fuse all of this in place. And with these big pieces, you want to take plenty of time to make sure you've got them secured and not have to worry about any wrinkles. But this was a happy accident to have the traverse stripe, the cool gray stripe for the mountain. I was not thinking about mountains when I designed it, but I think it's a great contrast to the gray Waypoints mountain on the left. Okay, and now it's time for the trees. And if you look at the template, it shows you where the trees will go. The tricky part is because that's in reverse, you've got to kind of flip it in your head. So I actually think it's more helpful to look at the assembly diagram and use that as a guide. And know that your mountains don't have to be placed exactly like mine, either what I do in this video or on the picture on the cover or the assembly diagram, but that's just meant to give you an idea. The keys to think about are making sure that the bases of the mountain are covered, because none of them have trunks. So you want to make sure that you're not leaving a floating tree somewhere. So you want to just keep an eye on that, and then make sure that you've got enough of the tree showing so that it definitely reads as a tree. And I just realized that in my eagerness to get those laid out, I didn't take the paper off the back. The other thing is you will likely end up trimming some of the trees on the edges, but I wanted to give you a full tree to work with so that you could choose based on your positioning how much of the tree gets trimmed. So after you've got your tree fused in place, you can just trim whatever's hanging off of that, off the edge of the muslin, and make that work for you. And I purposely have the trees overlapping the river because the more layering you have, the more dimensional your project will look. So if each tree is on its own, you won't have that dimensional look of what an actual tree and mountain landscape would look like. So I've got both of those overlapping my river, and then one more tree to put on. I liked having multiple teal choices to use for these pine trees because it made it easier to read them each, to visually read them as individual pines. So I'm going to pull them down to the bottom to make sure that where there's no trunk, that it isn't hanging out. I'm gonna pull this guy over a bit, but you can kind of play with the trees and get them how you want them to look. And then knowing that I'll be trimming some off as well. So try not to fuse those tree branches that are hanging off the edge, or they'll fuse down to your surface. Okay, and now it's time for the trees on the other side. And same thing, there will be some hanging off the edge of your landscape a little bit, and you can just trim those branches when you're done. Okay, so we're going to start with the dark one in the back, and then the patterned tree made from the Cairns print in the teal. There we go. Bring that one down a bit. Then one more dark teal one, which goes nearer the river. And I did that because if I put that one on top of the other dark teal tree I have, they blend together. Oops, got a little more paper. But by putting that over by the tree, it's not an issue. There we go. And last but not least, one more teal tree in the front. There we go. Okay, time to fuse these guys in place as well. Okay, and then last but not least, we've got our moon and our snow cap for the gray mountain. And with these, if you remember, I've got a layer of fusible interfacing in them so that the dark teal background doesn't show through the white waypoint white waypoint fabric. I'm gonna just get those both in their spot. The moon you can put wherever you want and fuse them down too. There we go. And then, like I said, next step is to trim off those tree branches that go past the edge of the muslin. And there's Moonlight Mountain. And now it's time to assemble River Gorge. And when you're assembling this one, if you look at the assembly diagram, it's got all the labeled pieces on it. This one I still start at the top, but I get the pieces around the river situated before I actually press them into place, just because there's a lot of different overlaps going on. So we're going to start out with our sky right here. And this was the third one I designed, and I was a little bit stuck before this because the Michigan dunes and Lake Michigan was an easy choice for me, as well as the mountains, which are, based on the Rockies, where I've hiked and camped and have a lot of fond memories of. And I just wasn't sure what to do for a third location. And I started thinking back to some of the trips that I'd taken when I was either a kid with my family or that my husband and I have done with our boys. And I remembered when I was in late elementary school, we went out west from Wisconsin, and one of the things we did was go rafting on the Colorado River. And I thought, well, that would be a different set of landscape images than I've done so far, different than the mountains, and to have that river. And that was such a great memory for me. And I've been whitewater rafting other times as well and really loved it. And so I thought that would be a perfect last scene. So I've got the reds and oranges that you see in Arizona for the rock formations, and then the river running through the middle. And that's roughly what it's meant to represent. Okay, so I'm gonna set my river up, and what helps set up the river is it's got a straight edge here on the upper right and then down here on the lower left. And so you can align those with the edges of the muslin. And then you know you've got everything in the right spot. Then I'm going to start adding in the other land pieces. Here's land number 4, and that's going to go over the river. And then land number 6 is also orange, and that's going to go over the river on this side. There we go. And then we move on to teal, which is land number 5. And that sits on top of the orange and on top of the edge of the river. And then last but not least, we have land number 7, the dark teal down at the base. Just, you can, because nothing is fused down yet, you can adjust it all a little bit. Make sure everything is where you want it with nothing showing through. There we go. Now I'm going to fuse these in place. And then the last piece for this one is the sun. And that, you can decide how close you want it to be to sunset by how low you put it in the sky. A little higher up, it is up to you where you put it. Let's turn this guy around. I'm going to put mine right there. And there we go. There's River Gorge. Just needs the borders added, and then I'll baste it, quilt it, bind it, and all 3 of these will be done. So once you have each of the 3 landscape tops appliqued, it's time to add the borders. And each of the 3 landscapes uses a different border print, and then baste layers together and machine quilt it. What I did for the machine quilting is I loosely went around each of the designs and then did some filler designs. It's actually a little easier to see the quilting on the back. I did not zigzag stitch down the edges because I just wanted a looser look to my machine quilting, but you can see I got close enough to the edges to help secure them. And since this is going to be a wall hanging and not a quilt that's going to be used and handled and washed, that kind of edge stitching works just fine. And then of course the last step is putting on this great stripe as a binding.